So my conflicts of interest are on the slide, and I'm going to talk about long-acting treatment in terms of clinical trials and real-world data. So as Sharon has very eloquently discussed, we've moved from an era of multiple pills a day to achieve survival to much simpler single tablet regimens. And now we have the option of using less is more, using 2 drug therapies as well as 3 drug therapies. And there are both oral and injectable options for this. So today I'm going to focus quite a bit on long-acting injectables for suppressed switch. I'm going to focus on cabotegravir or piperine dosed 2 monthly as an injectable combination in people who are already virally suppressed. So I'm going to start with preference. So why are we doing this? So as Sharon pointed out, stigma is a major issue. And if you look at this slide, this is looking across 6 studies. What we see is that more than 90% of participants who went into the study preferred the injectable regimen. Now, you can say that these were people who wanted injections, and that's true, but we're never going to force people to take injections. It's only ever going to be for those people who want it. So this shows a strong preference, and if you actually interrogate this preference further, what you find is that stigma, fear of inadvertent disclosure, daily reminder of treatment, as well as convenience are the key drivers of wanting this as a therapy. But does it actually work? So what we see here is the studies, the clinical trials and implementation science studies that have looked at 2 monthly administration of cabotegravir as treatment for virally suppressed people. What you see firstly is Atlas 2M study in which there was a confirmed virological failure rate of 1.7%. Now, subsequent studies have had much lower virological failure rates. And in the interim, between the Atlas 2M study and those subsequent studies, a multivariable analysis was done, which looked at the previous 3 studies using 1 monthly versus 2 monthly cabotegravir or piperine. And out of 1,651 participants, virological failure occurred in 23, which was a rate of 1.4%. So we did a multivariable analysis to try and understand, to look for a needle in a haystack, to try and understand in these small number of participants, are there factors that are common that can predict virological failure? And what we found is that there was an increased risk of confirmed virological failure in association with having 2 or more of the following baseline factors. So the first one is archived rilpivirine resistance associated mutations. This doesn't mean active resistance. It means that somewhere in the past you may have had either exposure and you may have a proviral DNA evidence. It also depends on subtype, and this is particularly the A6 subtype, and also BMI. So if we look at the different factors, what we see is when there are no baseline factors, the rate of virological failure is 0.4%. When there's 1 factor, it becomes 2%. And when you have more than 2 baseline factors, 2 or more, the rate goes up to 19%. So 1 in 5 people with 2 factors will experience virological failure. Now, the factors are not equal in weighting. Okay, so that's an important factor. BMI alone confers a very similar risk to people who don't have any factors. The risk is 0.5%. So the risk is really driven by rilpivirine resistance associated mutations that are archived and by the A6 subtype. So something that I'm often asked is what to do if someone experiences virological failure. So this slide summarizes participants across 5 clinical trials and what people gave the people after the virological failure. And what you can see is that clinicians primarily provided PIs, so protease inhibitor-based combinations. A few got integrase inhibitor-based regimens. They got 3 drug therapies. And for everybody, it was possible to construct a regimen, and almost everybody resuppressed except those who disengaged or were on lopinavir. So I'm going to move to the CARE study, which is a very, very important study, which looked at robustness of cabotegravir or piperine delivered in sub-Saharan Africa in 3 different countries, Uganda, Kenya, and South Africa. Now, the important thing about the study is that therapy was delivered in the context of a public health setting, so a public health intervention. So the clinicians did not have access to baseline resistance, which means they couldn't apply this multivariable analysis, the clinical predictive scores. And also, viral load monitoring was done every 24 weeks, which is less frequent than many treatment guidelines. This population represented the global population of people living with HIV, and that 58% were women. The majority of the participants were Black. 1 in 5 had a BMI greater than 30, and 57% had the A1 subtype. So this is really the first time we've seen how the regimen performs in a large number of people with the A1 subtype, so it's very important. Almost everyone was switched away from an integrase inhibitor, but more than 70% had prior exposure to NNRTIs. And what this means is that there was a history of exposure, which increases the risk of proviral DNA evidence of rilpivirine resistance. And they'd been on treatment for about 8 years. So you can see the study recruited adults without any history of hepatitis B. Even people with core antibodies were excluded. No treatment history of failure, and viral loads who were undetectable for at least 4 months. And you can see it was compared against the standard of care oral therapy that was available in the country. It was administered 2 monthly. What you see here is a very high efficacy that was achieved. 96% was suppressed, and you can see cabotegravir rilpivirine is in the purple, my favorite color. And you can also see, in case you hadn't realized, you can also see that there were 2 instances of virological failure. One person had a confirmed viral load and the other person had a viremia, but unfortunately passed away due to an unrelated event, so the viral failure couldn't be confirmed. But both of these people developed resistance to both cabotegravir and rilpivirine. It was very safe and well tolerated with low rate of grade 3 events. So in terms of the high rates of adherence, retention, and satisfaction, what we see is that there were very high rates of retention. 99% were retained. 96% of injections occurred within the 7-day window. This is something very important and something we worry about. Are we going to be able to care for these people? Will we be able to get people back? And it's something we scrutinize very closely, and it went very well in this study. And we can see that there was statistically significant increases in treatment satisfaction for the injectable arm versus the oral arm. So I'm going to talk about another population, which is the Western Australia cohort, the JABS cohort, who had a lot of complexities in terms of difficulties with adherence and various other comorbidities, both mental health, substance use. And they were virally suppressed when they started. But the most important thing that I want to say about it is they were able to get people in, even in this population, and 97.2% achieved on-time injection. So that's another reassuring thing for clinicians. Can we manage this in people who struggle with oral therapy? So there are 28 unique real-world cohorts that have monitored people living with HIV who are virally suppressed across different countries. And what we see is that where effectiveness is reported, it is high, above 90%. And we see the confirmed virological failure rates are similar to the clinical trials, so low. But what we do see is that when resistance occurs, it tends to occur generally to 2 classes or to 1 class, so it has the same outcome as we've seen in the clinical trials. Something that's of great concern to me when trying to understand the real-world data is that confirmed virological failure definitions vary across these cohorts. So we looked at a number of cohorts. My colleague, Dr. Kyle Ring, presented this at the British HIV Association conference, looking at 39 real-world cohorts, and we found 10 definitions of virological failure, 10 definitions, including such a restrictive definition as 1 viral load greater than 20. So how can we understand the real-world data if we're having such differing definitions? It's absolutely vital that the community comes together to understand what this actually means. If we look at discontinuations, you can see that these are low, and you can see that injection-related discontinuations are very low across these different studies. In terms of inclusion, we're doing very badly. In the randomized studies, 25% of females were included. 28% were racialized minorities, and 18% were aged over 50. So this is really depressing, and I can tell you that the same obtains in the real-world evidence. We've presented this previously. So I'd like to draw your attention to late breaker poster 12, which is the Ilana study. It is the first delivery of cabotegravir piperine in the community settings, multiple community settings, as well as in the clinic. And we did actually manage to achieve targets which were representative of the global population of people living with HIV. So in terms of highly treatment experienced people, we also have injectables for people who are highly treatment experienced, and you've already heard about lenacapavir and the stunning results in PrEP. But there are some pretty impressive results for lenacapavir in people who have highly treatment experience with lots of resistance or unable to take oral therapies. So what we see here is this first-in-class capsid inhibitor. Currently, it has no long-acting partner, so it needs to be used with oral therapy when it comes to treatment, an oral backbone regimen. And what we see here is the Capella study, which is looking at these people who had no treatment options. And what we can see here is that very high levels of viral suppression, both less than 50 copies and less than 200. And even on the right, in people who had no other active agents in their oral backbone, still were able to achieve high rates of suppression. And this is very, very important for this group of people who have very few options. So the summary is that it's important that clinicians for cabotegravir or piperine in virally suppressed people consider offering this equitably to eligible people who want it, and we really need equity of access globally, as has been said by my predecessors. It's also important to think about and offer lenacapavir plus an optimized backbone to highly treatment experienced people who need it. So what about the future? A few people have mentioned the future. It's always good to look forward. And we have many classes in clinical development, which is really exciting. But it's important to note, as Jürgen has pointed out, that not all of these regimens actually get to the bench. Things don't necessarily go from the bench to the bedside. So although we have all these options, they may not all reach patients. Furthermore, what's important to say is that after 40 years, we truly know what it is that we need. And what we need is at least 2 compounds that can work together, that are compatible in terms of side effects, in terms of viral synergy, in terms of frequency of administration. These are vital in order to achieve similar to what we've achieved with oral regimens. So I'd like to thank all my colleagues within the SHARE Collaborative and our Community Advisory Board, and I will take questions a little bit later.